the quiet of the countryside. Up with the dawn, tools down at sunset. The schedule of a simple life. Not much happens around here, and if change comes, it comes so slowly, if in a lifetime at all. For most people in the Middle Ages, this was the normal scene of life, far removed from the noise of those trumpets accompanying the knights of shining armor, or the ladies in silken gowns in those great castles. No, the reality of daily life in medieval England was a little more monotonous than that, but certainly not without its eccentricities. Medieval England was overwhelmingly rural. In fact, over 90% of the population were peasants living in villages and farming whatever land they had. Yet the lives of these ordinary men and women are often overlooked. We always talk about the kings, the castles, the battles, but history is a bit deeper than that. And so today, that is exactly where we go, not to these great, grand events, but to the smaller things. A guided tour through a village, long abandoned, and all those souls that lived within. And I think we can discover a little life, a simple life, difficult and constrained by feudal duties, but is also one of community, tradition, and ultimately, great resilience. We'll span the entire medieval period, but we will stay within England. Talk about how peasants lived, using archaeological and historical evidence, and we'll try and piece together a picture in our mind of what a day for a medieval peasant might actually look like. Well, before we begin, I'll issue the normal welcome to the channel. It's good to see you all here. Here we go again, back to medieval England today. It seems to be geographically a place of quite a lot of interest and quite quintessential when we talk about the medieval period, particularly in a Western cultural scope. In other videos, we will go to other parts, perhaps. Let me know what you want to see in the comments. Of course, I will remind you to do the like and subscribe thing, and also this video is completely ad-free like everything else. So this is made possible due to the contributions on Patreon, YouTube members, those who checked out the merch store, and of course the donations on the PayPal and super thanks. This is all available in the pinned comment and links in the video and channel description. That's if I've not forgotten to put the pinned comment in. Fingers crossed. Well, with introductions out of the way, I think we can get to our topic for today, how medieval English peasants actually lived. So relax and we may begin. And so here we find ourselves in the medieval village, and the peasant having his place in a society. When we say village, what do we mean? Well, it is effectively a small world of its own, a cluster of thatched cottages and barns amid the strips of cultivated fields, with the parish church and often a manor house at the center. We'll get to that a little bit later. But here the peasants lived under the system of manorial feudalism that bound them to a lord. Now, most were unfree serfs, which were also called villeins, who owed heavy obligations to the lord of the manor, though a minority were actually free tenants, who paid rent in cash or kind for their land. Think about things like if they were farming a certain crop, they would give a certain crop of that to make up for any coin they would not give. That's a pretty typical arrangement. And that was that the peasant family held and farmed some lands for its own sustenance, but in return owed labor and dues to the lord. In many parts of England, villages operated an open field system of agriculture. The arable land was divided into large fields, which were then subdivided again into long strips. Each household's holding consisted of strips scattered across different fields, a kind of a way to share both the good and bad land. Not all soils are created equal, I'm afraid. Well, the system forced neighbors to cooperate. They plowed and sowed according to an agreed schedule. By the High Middle Ages, a three-field rotation prevailed in many regions. For example, one field planted in autumn with winter wheat or rye, and one in spring with oats, barley, or peas. But the third field would be left fallow. Over-farming the soil, well, that's not good for anyone. In any case, this helped maximize yields, but also required coordination among villagers. Now, of course, we go straight into agriculture, and we have to talk about that because, well, that is the life of a feudal peasant, of course. We cannot go past that. And talking about it, in the first place, well, it's certainly a good place to set the scene. You can't have a peasant without farming, of course. Now, for the unfree peasant, there were also feudal obligations. Let me explain. A villein, that is the unfree peasant, owed the lord labor services on the lord's own land. Now, typically they'd work for the lord for 2 or 3 days each week, perhaps more at busy times. During harvest and planting, the lord could demand boon days, that meaning extra work from all of the peasants to ensure the lord's crops were brought in first, perhaps in exchange for a meal, some ale, something like that, a big sack of onions, whatever it is. Now, beyond labor, peasants also paid numerous dues and fines. They paid a yearly rent, often in grain, eggs, or other produce for the small lands they were allowed to farm for themselves. But they also had to pay special fees on life events. For example, a serf who wanted to, let's say, marry someone from outside the manor needed the lord's permission, and they paid what is called a merchet, that is a marriage fine. When a serf died, the family owed the lord a heriot, often the best beast, as a death duty. Could be the finest cow, finest ox. Serfs were typically required to use the lord's mill and grind their grain, and his oven too, to bake bread. Of course, using that, they'd have to pay a portion of flour or loaves of bread as a fee. You can see how it's a pretty good deal for the lord, of course. But even gathering firewood or pasturing pigs in the lord's forest, regardless if he was using it or not, that might incur a small charge. Of course, we must remember that all of this depends on what the lord is going to charge. You could have lords that were a little bit more tolerant, and ones who were a little bit more, let's say, entrepreneurial. Now, virtually every aspect of a peasant's livelihood in general was still subject to the lord's control, or perhaps a toll imposed upon them. A serf couldn't freely leave the manor or sell his oxen without permission. Everything had to go through the higher-ups. So in effect, the law regarded the villein's person as goods, as the lord's property, not the peasant's property. A state of affairs that most people naturally resented, and which they constantly sought to alleviate. I'm sure you can imagine people saying back in the day, well, it's not a perfect system, but it's the only system we have. They invented other systems. Spoiler alert. Of course, peasants, not all of them were equal. Not all equally oppressed, at least. A free peasant, also called a freeman, well, they owed no labor duty at all. Instead, he paid a fixed rent, and he could move about or marry without seeking the lord's consent. Free tenants were, however, a minority in most villages, but some regions, especially frontiers or newly settled lands, had more of them. There were gradations even among unfree peasants, though. A substantial tenant with 20 to 30 acres lived more securely than a cottager with only a couple of acres, who had no labor for others to survive. But still, all peasants were low in status, at least compared to the nobility, and they lived with few comforts. Now, over the centuries, these feudal bonds did gradually loosen. By the 14th century, many lords found it convenient to accept money payments in lieu of labor, a practice called commutation. And that basically means that if a peasant could scrape together a bit of money, maybe selling their own goods at the market for a surplus rather, he might pay a fixed sum instead of performing days of labor, buying back his time and allowing him to spend more time on his own farm. Now, the catastrophic population loss of the Black Death actually accelerated this trend. We talked about that in the Black Death videos and the aftermath of the Black Death in medieval England video. You see, far fewer workers were available, and the surviving peasants, well, they gained quite a bit of bargaining power. Wages for farm work rose, and lords increasingly had to persuade rather than compel peasants to work. If they didn't like the conditions, well, they would just pack their bags and they would get a job anywhere else. A labor crisis in the favor of the laborers. Well, some serfs even fled their manors to seek freedom in the growing towns, where a common saying held that town air makes free after a year and a day. And over time, in general, social attitudes and legal judgments began to favor liberty over bondage. By the late 15th century, serfdom in England was largely dying out. Most peasants had become tenant farmers, free in a nominal sense, paying rent for their land rather than laboring under these ancient obligations. They were still poor, don't get me wrong, and, well and truly subordinate. It's not real freedom in the modern sense, if you've even got that. But the personal bondage that characterized the early medieval serfdom was well and truly coming to an end. In short, through quiet transformations and the occasional rebellion here and then, the English peasantry gained a greater measure of freedom as the medieval period drew to a close. That's all good and well, but what exactly were they doing between the rebellions and between the transformations? Let's take a look at the daily work of peasants. Now we can understand that. Step into the shoes, or lack of. Well, when we talk about the daily work, we pretty much look at it in the cycle of seasons and just the general demands of agriculture. Typically, as we mentioned in the introduction, the day begins at first light. Either at sunrise or at the cock's crow, men and women would rise from pretty simple beds. After maybe a quick bite of bread or a little bit of porridge, modest breakfast if any, time to set out to the fields. Now, work usually started at first light because there were only so many hours of day that they had, and there was plenty of hours of labor to be done, labor that could only be done in that precious daylight. Tasks depended on the seasons, of course. Ploughing, sowing, weeding, reaping, threshing. In the fields, peasants often worked communally. For example, several households might pool their oxen to pull a heavy plough. One family alone might not own a full team. You see, it took perhaps 8 oxen to haul a large plough through heavy clay soil. One man would guide the plough, another drive the oxen, while others might follow with harrows to cover the seed. As you can imagine, this is not quick work, rather it being slow and strenuous. In fact, an English poet in the 14th century, William Langlet, gives an image of a poor ploughman at work, hood and shoes full of holes, his hair and toes sticking out, body smeared with mud as he trudges behind the oxen. And that's pretty accurate. shows the hardship of physical toll on a medieval farm. In any case, the morning had passed, and by midday, peasants would pause for their main meal, or perhaps just a short rest. Now, this would be kind of their dinner. It might be taken at home if the fields were nearby, or more often they would just sit down in the field and partake in a short meal together. We can imagine a group of field laborers seeking shade under a tree at the edge of a field, perhaps, sharing a few bits of bread, cheese, perhaps some weak ale, bought by one of them in a leather jug. They wouldn't be drinking much water. Ale was the drink of choice. Sometimes other watered-down beers and things like that. In any case, after this brief respite, it was back to work until the sun went down. The workday might last until sundown, especially in summer when the days were long. In winter, though, darkness, of course, falls a bit earlier. But winter days were filled with other tasks, like mending tools, twisting rope, or perhaps weaving baskets by the hearth. Really, you've got to spend your time doing something, don't you? And days before electricity, well, you may as well just sit there at the fire and make things. In any case, each season, as we mentioned, had its labors, and medieval calendars often showed the work of the months. Now, what I mean by that is in spring, roughly March and April in England, fields had to be ploughed and sown with barley, oats, peas, and other crops. Ploughing was also a major task. Peasants drove teams of oxen to pull the heavy wooden plough with its iron ploughshare to turn the soil after winter. It often required 8 oxen to pull a single plough, as we mentioned, so contributions, each coming together to make up a full team. After ploughing, the seeds were sown by hand and harrowed, and, well, spring in general was also a time to plant peas and beans, repair fences, tend to sheep shearing, and have a little cottage industry. Wool, very important. Well, summer, that is June through August, that was a period of growing and haymaking. Meadows had to be mowed for hay. Peasants, being men, women, and older children, would cut tall grass with scythes and rake it into piles to dry. Now, hay was a crucial fodder for livestock in the winter. Of course, you would try and keep them inside, not to have them starve. Summer was also a time for weeding the crop fields and shearing sheep. In late spring or early summer to gather wool to help the sheep stay cool as well. So by the late summer, the grain harvest arrived. The most intense period of work in the year was well and truly on for young and old when it got to this point. Harvesting wheat, rye, oats, and barley meant long days of reaping entirely by hand. Men and women stooped to cut the grain with sickles or scythes under that hot August sun. The Lord's fields also had to be harvested first if you were a serf. Only then could the peasant attend to his own small plot. Priorities had to be in order, of course, and the priorities were set by the nobles. Harvest was truly an all-hands-on-deck affair. Entire families, including children as young as 5 or 6, helped in whatever ways they could. Gleaning, that is, collecting stray stalks left behind, was often done by the very old or perhaps the very young. The timing was also crucial. A rainstorm or early frost could ruin a ripe crop, so the community made a collective effort to get everyone's grain safely in. After cutting, the grain was bundled into sheaves and carted to the barn, and it was there that it had to be threshed, beaten with flails to knock the kernels out of the husks, and then winnowed. That is, by the way, just kind of like tossing it in the air so the chaff blew away. It looks kind of like dust, almost. You know, separate the wheat from the chaff. That's where this comes from. In any case, these tasks often were quite extensive, and they often extended into the autumn months. Now, September to October brought other tasks as well. Some of the harvested grain, especially wheat and rye, was used as seed for the next year. Peasants plowed and sowed their fields again in early fall to plant winter wheat or rye that would sprout before frost and be harvested the next year. Any animals that could not be fed through the winter might be slaughtered in the late autumn, and thus November was often actually called Martinmas slaughter, where surplus pigs or cattle were butchered, the meat being salted or smoked for preservation. Autumn was also a time for collecting foods like nuts, berries, and mushrooms in the woods to add to the winter stores. Pretty much anything they could get to throw into that pottage mix. And then we hit winter, November to February. That was the quieter season for field work, and certainly not a time of leisure. In fact, well, it was not a pleasant time for anyone. With the ground hard or barren, peasants focused on indoor and maintenance tasks. They repaired tools, made carts, wove baskets, perhaps made or mended clothing. Women spent long winter hours spinning wool into yarn and knitting or weaving. But winter also was the season to haul timber or cut firewood from the woodlands. A back-breaking chore, but, well, would you rather freeze to death? Also, what else are you going to cook with? The fire doesn't come out of nowhere. As for the livestock, as we mentioned, they needed help throughout the winter. Cows and sheep had to be fed with whatever hay and straw had been stored, and their stalls mucked out. Every peasant learned to be pretty resourceful in winter. If you didn't learn, you died. For instance, making rushlights, that is, candles from animal fat or dried rushes, or carving new wooden bowls and utensils by the fireside. And though the days were short, the winter nights were long. Peasants often rose before sunrise to tend animals, and might gather around the hearth in the evening to tell stories, mend the nets or harnesses, or simply just to conserve a bit of warmth, another precious commodity. But winter was also a time when the community socialized more. Yeah, it was cold outside, but, well, there was less field labor to do. We shall see that later. Many traditional village festivities took places in midwinter too. In any case, throughout the year, every member of a peasant household had work suited to their strength. The men would do the heaviest ploughing, carting, and woodcutting, while women performed a double burden of work, assisting in the fields during peak times, and doing endless daily chores of cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing, along with the dairying and spinning. Anything else they could find, really. As for the children, well, the ones as young as 5 were expected to help out. It might have been running to fetch water, these kinds of things, keeping an eye on grazing geese, scaring crows from the newly sown seed. By their early teens, peasant boys and girls were working almost as full adults, the boys in the fields, or learning a craft, and the girls would be around the home. But despite the long hours of toil, peasants did not work every single day. Sundays were the holy day of rest, when field labor ceased, and by church law, everybody attended Mass. In addition, the medieval calendar was filled with saints' feast days and church holidays, on which no servile work was supposed to be done. Many of these fell in spring or summer, giving brief respites from labor, while peasants certainly had to work extremely hard, especially in the peak season. It's a misconception that they never had days off. In fact, many of them probably had more days off than we do in our modern era, which is, well, a little bit scary. Between Sundays and various holy days, a medieval peasant might have upwards of 8 to 10 weeks off over the course of a year. Doesn't sound too bad, doesn't it? Though on those days they might still do light chores or tend animals, and not all lords honored every holiday. But think about it, if you take time off work, you probably end up cleaning the house at least 1 or 2 days out of that, so it's all in perspective. Nevertheless, these periodic breaks, Christmas, Easter, numerous saints' festivals, these kind of things, they provided a much-needed rest, and of course a time for community recreation, as we'll get to a little bit later. But let's get out of the fields. They had to go home eventually, didn't they? If the fields were the workplace, well, the homes were the humble shelters offering minimal comfort. But of course, you make it your own, don't you? Now, a typical peasant family lived in a small cottage, usually made of something called wattle and daub. If you don't know what that is, it's woven wooden rods that were kind of plastered with mud and straw. Rough timber with a thatched roof. We've seen it. Now, these houses were often just 1 or 2 rooms. Pretty simple stuff. The floor was beaten earth, sometimes covered with straw or rushes to absorb dirt, and there were usually no real windows. Perhaps a tiny opening with a wooden shutter, so indoors was pretty dim and pretty smoky. They hadn't quite figured out chimneys yet. In the middle of the main room was a hearth fire burning for cooking and warmth. Smoke from the fire drifted up and escaped through a hole in the roof, or through the thatch at least, which blackened the rafters, so there was something, but still not like a chimney in the modern sense. The atmosphere inside was perpetually smoky because of this, irritating to the eyes and lungs, but, well, people just got used to it. Now as for the furnishings, well, they were sparse and quite homemade. Simple stuff. A few stools or benches, a simple table made of boards laid on trestles, taken down when not in use most of the time, and perhaps a wooden chest to store clothing or grain. Those were the main items. At mealtime, the family would sit on benches at the trestle table and eat from wooden bowls or coarse pottery dishes, using wooden spoons. Knives were shared and forks were unknown at the time. Cooking was done at the open hearth. There was no oven inside a peasant cottage. Villagers often had a lord's oven or a communal bake oven that everyone used. Instead, simple breads or cakes were baked on flat stones, in the embers or in iron pans propped on the fire. A heavy iron pot or kettle would hang over the flames, used to boil porridge or perhaps stew, the ubiquitous pottage that I've mentioned briefly, but we'll discuss a bit more in the next section. The household wife would have to mind this fire constantly, both to keep the home warm, but also to have hot coals for cooking. She likely also used the residual heat of the hearth for tasks like drying grain or herbs. Peasant families did many domestic chores indoors too. Women brewed ale in small batches, churned butter when they had milk, and spun wool or flax into yarn, often with what was known as a drop spindle. Spinning wheels were a bit of a later arrival, even though we do see them quite a lot in medieval artwork. Said those women in the silk dresses spinning at the wheel. They were a bit of a later invention. Now as for laundry, that was infrequent, but when they did do it, it was quite arduous. Clothes had to be soaked and scrubbed with lye. That is a harsh soap made from ashes. It's spelt Lye, by the way. And they would do this in a big wooden tub, and water for washing had to be hauled from the well or the stream, so there's the weight of that as well. The floor, strewn with straw or rushes, was swept now and then and renewed with fresh bedding, with fresh bedding straw only a few times a year. Now, inevitably, the house was dirty by modern standards. No one's really denying that. It didn't help that chickens and other small animals sometimes wandered in and out, and, well, that just adds to the mess without becoming too descriptive. At night time, the family slept on simple beds or pallets, A bed, if we're going to use that term, might just be a cloth sack stuffed with straw or wool scraps, laid on the floor, or in a crude wooden frame. They used coarse wool blankets or old fur cloaks for covers. Several family members often shared one bed for warmth, just out of practicality. And it was not unusual for husband, wife, and young children to all sleep together on a large pallet on the floor, with perhaps an elderly parent or a visiting relative curled up nearby. As for privacy, good luck with that. It was minimal if you were lucky, non-existent if you were like everyone else. A fire was typically kept smoldering through the night, banked under ashes or a fire cover, so it could be revived the next morning. Now, they had to have the homes double as shelter for animals as well. You see, in many cottages, one end of the building was sectioned off as a pen or byre for a cow, donkey, or a few goats or sheep, especially in winter when valuable animals needed protection from the cold or from thieves or wolves. Of course, back in those days, wolves were all over the place, so were the thieves. In smaller dwellings, the family's chickens or a pig might share this living space, wandering in freely. This gave the animals warmth and safety, and in turn helped warm the house slightly, but it certainly added to the odor. Imagine the smell. Well, fleas and mice were common problems. The continual smoke of the hearth ironically helped deter some vermin, keeping the rafters sooty and the air acrid. Cleaning was a Sisyphean task, if we could put it that way. One medieval writer humorously described how a peasant housewife would sweep out the dirt and straw from the floor, only for the chickens to come in and scratch it all around again. Definitely a task worthy of calling it a Sisyphean. Well, despite the cramped and smoky conditions, it was still a home, and I suppose it's not too bad when you got nothing else to compare it to. A place of family comfort, and it's certainly better than sleeping outside in the cold. In the evenings around the hearth, parents would tell stories or sing to their children. Family members mended their clothes or carved little tools by firelight. And in winter, neighbors might drop in, share a little bit of warmth, or a cup of ale, exchanging tales or gossip. Such moments provided what we can imagine as a bit of emotional relief from the grind of work. Yes, life is difficult, but we're all here together, and that's something at least. And so within those walls, just like our modern-day family life unfolded, children were born and raised, meals were prepared and shared, fights happened, laughter happened, all echoing off those smoky rafters. That humble cottage, serving as a backdrop for all of the peasants' joys and sorrows, from the cradle to the grave. Very, very human. And this is where we come to the next thing. Food. Probably the most important thing next to warmth. A lot of moving parts, sure, but it's pretty complicated to get the right amount of sustenance in that time. The diet was pretty simple, too, not to mention repetitive. The primary staple was bread. Medieval peasants typically ate coarse, dark bread made from cheaper grains like rye, barley, or oats, and wheat was the most prized grain. Unfortunately, it was often reserved for the lord or for market sale, so common folk usually baked loaves of what was called maslin, a mix of rye and wheat flour, or bread made from barley or oats. The result? A dense, heavy loaf, very unlike the modern, fluffy white bread, but I don't think many people are eating white bread anymore. It's a bit, you gotta go the multi-grain sort of stuff, you know what I mean? You know what I mean. Well, a peasant household might grind its grain by hand. Just get that rock out and start bashing it, grinding it on a stone, this kind of thing. Found plenty of those sorts of stones in the old medieval houses, that's for sure. Or perhaps they would take it to the lord's grinding mill, as if the lord had one, but of course you would have a fee charged with that as well. Then they would bake bread in a communal oven or at home on the hearth. Now this bread, along with pottage, a kind of vegetable stew or whatever you could find to put in it, formed the basis of pretty much every meal. Now the other daily mainstay was indeed pottage, a thick soup or stew cooked in an iron pot over the fire, hence the name pottage. Peasant wives became adept in making filling pottage out of really whatever was available, which could vary from day to day, of course. But if we can imagine a basic pottage, well, it might include oats or barley for thickness, some beans or peas, and garden vegetables like cabbage, onions, or leeks, all boiled together in water. They would season it with a bit of salt and herbs, like parsley, thyme, or sage. You could find them in a cottage garden. Most peasant families maintained a small kitchen plot to grow greens and root vegetables, and they kept a few chickens or eggs. If they were fortunate enough, they could have a cow or some goats for milk, and they would also churn a bit of butter, make simple cheese, valuable proteins and fats to their otherwise diet of starch. The pottage was usually meatless. If available, a scrap of bacon fat or maybe a ham bone might be added, but that was a rare luxury. Essentially, peasants ate a kind of vegetarian diet, but rather by necessity, rather, for much of the year, not by their own choice. The peasants' meals were, indeed, remarkably monotonous by our modern standards. Breakfast, if taken at all, might be just a little bit of leftover cold porridge, or bread, perhaps a little bit of cheese, but, well, if you were lucky, you'd have that. The main meal around midday, that'd be bread and pottage, maybe with a bit of onion, some curds, washed down with a bit of ale. And in the evening, another round of pottage or broth might be served as a kind of supper. Now, even on work days in the field, this little picnic would be a hunk of bread, a piece of dry cheese or salted fish, and of course that flask of weak ale. So it wasn't like it was better on the weekdays or weekends. It was every day just the same. Still, a diet of high-fiber bread and beans, while pretty bland, provided the essential carbohydrates and a few proteins, especially when peas and grain were combined. Now, ale we've mentioned a few times, and that was the universal drink of medieval peasants. Not just in England either, but quite much the same case on the continent. Because clean drinking water was not always available, and because fermentation killed many pathogens, whether they understood that at the time, they just knew they didn't get sick when they drank it, ale was consumed in great quantities by everyone, and that includes children. The medieval ale was a barley-based brew, made without hops. You see, hopped beer would come a bit later, and it was usually quite weak in alcohol. It might be closer to a soupy sort of small beer, a real light one, often slightly sour or yeasty, and was meant for hydration and nutrition more than intoxication and celebration. According to various records, an adult peasant might drink a gallon or more of ale per day, though ale in this context was more like a low-alcohol porridge than the strong beers that we think of today. As for brewing, that was typically done by the women of the village, and at a household level. If you've heard the term alewife, well, that's where this comes from. Ale provided much-needed calories. It was sometimes even called liquid bread. Peasants would drink ale at every meal, It was safer than most water, certainly more filling. Of course, ale could be festive too. Stronger batches were brewed for holidays and celebrations. But the everyday ale was mild enough that peasants could consume it throughout the day and still labor on effectively. In any case, without ale, the medieval peasant diet would have been even more meager. At least with it, they got a few B vitamins and hydration along with their bread. Of course, they didn't understand all the nutrition back in those days, but they certainly understood when you didn't eat well, or when you drink bad water, dirty things, you got sick, things like miasma theory and all the rest. They had an understanding of it, just not on a scientific basis, more of a practical thing. Now, vegetables, legumes, and dairy supplemented this diet when possible. Gardens yielded cabbages, beans, lentils, peas, turnips, garlic, beets, other crops when they were in season. A surprising variety. But peasants also foraged wild foods, berries and nuts from the woods, wild greens like nettles, dandelion, etc., for salads or pottage, and apples or pears from hedgerows. But the dairy products really were prized. Milk from a cow or a goat would usually be turned into butter or soft cheese, because fresh milk, well, that spoiled quickly, and many adults were somewhat lactose intolerant. Butter added fats and flavor to otherwise bland foods. Cheese, often a crumbly, fresh cheese, could be eaten with bread or melted into pottage, which, of course, thickens it up a little bit. Eggs from hens were another important protein source, used in cooking or eaten on their own when available. And all these elements, of course, had to vary by season. Spring and summer offered fresh greens, eggs, and milk, whereas winter diets, well, you'd be relying more on salted or dried foods, and of course, whatever was stored from the harvest. Well, and meat, of course, if you could get it, good for you. But of course, it's far rarer on the peasant table. Most peasants could only afford to have it every now and then. And it wasn't in that fresh form, it was usually in the form of salted or smoked meat. A common family might raise a pig throughout the year and slaughter it in late fall. Pork was the primary meat of the peasantry because pigs were relatively easy to feed, and they could forage in the forest for acorns, that kind of thing. They also yielded a lot of fat. Salted pork and lard could last all winter. After the autumn slaughter, the family would have some fresh pork for a feast, but the rest was preserved with salt or smoke. That bacon or ham was then rationed carefully and used to flavor soups or accompany bread on special days. Fresh beef or mutton was pretty uncommon. Cattle or sheep were too valuable alive. Think about milk, wool, traction. They wouldn't butcher 'em unless the animal was old or injured. Chickens were generally provided eggs and were only eaten when they stopped laying them. So you might be thinking, well, why didn't they just go hunting? Good question. The problem with that is that forests were typically the lord's property, and that meant they were off limits. Poaching a deer or a boar could get a peasant harshly punished. Well, harshly punished, I don't mean a fine. Bad things happen. Nonetheless, peasants did catch smaller game, they just did it on the sly. Rabbits, hares, birds, or fish from the streams, no one could really stop them from doing that. They added a bit of meat to their diet every now and then. On Fridays and during Lent, the church forbade meat entirely. So those days peasants ate things like herring, if they could buy dried fish, or they simply went without meat at all. Many inland villages were far from the sea too, but eels from rivers and ponds were a common poor man's fish. Eels were actually so plentiful in medieval England that they were sometimes used to pay rent. You should imagine that. showing up to your landlord, giving him a big bag full of eels. I don't know how many months that would get you. I suppose it depends on how many eels you give them. Well, in any case, yes, food was there. You could get it. You could farm. You could do a little bit of trapping or fishing on the sly, but a lot of peasants always lived close to the brink of hunger. One bad harvest meant real hardship, and you were in trouble if you had two. That could even mean famine, as happened in 1315 to 1317 when incessant rains caused crops to rot and thousands of people across England starved. Bad times. In lean times in general, they stretched their food by mixing filler into bread, like peas, beans, or worse. Who knows what they could put in there, a little bit of sawdust for good measure, or by simply going without. Spring was often a hungry season, when the winter stores ran low, but the new crops were not quite ready to be harvested, and true famine, as in the years of 1315 to 17 as we mentioned, struck occasionally. Conversely, in the good years, while their diet was plain and monotonous, most peasant families could at least fill their stomachs with bread and pottage, and, well, that's enough to keep you alive. And of course, the lords knew it was enough to keep people in the fields working, just enough to work, but not enough to really have a good quality of life. Of course, only on special occasions or holidays did they taste a richer fare. It wasn't like they went their whole lives without having something nice, but they'd have to wait around a bit. Special things for special occasions. A village might collectively slaughter an animal for a feast, or bake some meat pies for Christmas or a wedding. Occasions where everyone could briefly eat to their fill. Good times, happy people, this kind of thing. But those were extraordinary days. On the ordinary days, a medieval English peasant just ate to survive, not to savor. A chunk of coarse bread, a bowl of vegetable stew, and a draught of weak ale. Those were the basics that fueled their labor. And what about peasant clothing? That's, of course, another topic of discussion when it comes to the appearance of a peasant. Well, it was above all practical, built for hard use, made from the materials at hand. The primary fabric? Wool, abundant thanks to England's many sheep. Almost all outer garments, tunics, dresses, cloaks, hose, they were all made of coarse woolen cloth that was thick, warm, and hard wearing, if also a little heavy and scratchy. But for lighter or undergarments, they used linen when possible, woven from flax, anyway, but linen was relatively expensive, so many poorer peasants had no linen at all, and they would just wear the wool raw on the skin. Colors were mostly natural or earth-toned. Wool straight from brown or gray sheep produced drab cloth. Some clothing was dyed with inexpensive local dyes, that is, dull yellows, greens, or russets, but bright and rich colors like deep blues, reds, and blacks were largely the preserve of the wealthy, who could afford such things. Thus, a typical peasant could be seen clad in dull browns, dusty grays, and washed-out greens. The better to hide the dirt, I suppose, and last a bit longer. A peasant man typically wore a knee-length wool tunic as his main garment. It was belted at the waist with a cord or leather strap and served as both a shirt and a coat. For his legs, he had woolen hose, that is, long stockings reaching up toward the thigh. On his feet he wore simple leather shoes if he owned them. Otherwise, he often went barefoot in warmer months to save his footwear for winter. In cold or wet weather, a man might layer a second tunic or a rough sleeveless jacket over the first, and on a woolen hood or cowl that covered his head, neck, and shoulders. But even so, His clothing only gave modest protection from the elements. After hours in the field, his hose were often soaked and muddy, and over time his garments became frayed, patched, and stained from hard use. A peasant woman's main garment was a long woolen gown, a basic dress that extended to her ankles. It was usually long-sleeved and loosely fitted, and she cinched it at the waist with a simple belt. Underneath, if she was fortunate, she might have a linen shirt. Otherwise, she wore the wool gown over the bare skin. When doing heavy work, she often hitched up her skirts and tucked them into her belt to keep them out of the dirt. A woman always kept her head covered in public, typically with a wimple or a kerchief, which was a linen cloth draped over her hair, and sometimes around the chin. This head covering protected her hair and satisfied the era's customs of modesty. For footwear, women had much of the same as men: low leather shoes or perhaps clogs when available, and bare feet when necessary. Because cloth was labor-intensive to make, each person owned very few sets of clothes. A peasant might wear the same tunic every day for most of the year, with perhaps a slightly less worn one kept for the holy days or festivals. Your work clothes and your party clothes, I suppose. Garments were patched and repatched and patched up again. Elbows and knees especially showed layers of mending. Washing clothes was difficult. As we mentioned, it required hauling and heating water, making soap from wood ash, so outer clothes were not washed often. Instead, people just wore linen undergarments when possible and washed those occasionally, and simply shook out or brushed off their woolen outerwear. As a result, peasant clothing was usually dingy, having the odors of smoke, sweat, and earth. Contemporary observers sometimes describe the country people as rough and rustic in appearance. We have one vivid portrait in William Langland's 14th century poem Piers Plowman, where a poor plowman and his wife are depicted in patched and tattered attire, the man's hood's full of holes and old, through which his hair pokes out and his shoes have broken toes sticking through. He is all smeared with mud as he follows the plow. And beside him there is his wife. She trudges with her skirts hitched up, wearing a threadbare smock. She has no proper shoes, only torn cloth wrappings, and her bare feet bleed from the cold ground. Well, it's a literary description, though part of an allegory, but it does match what we know from historical records. He doesn't seem to be dramatizing anything for dramatic effect. Many peasants truly had only very worn garments, and often went barefoot even in harsh conditions. Despite these realities, on Sundays, or at a village festival, they did their best to make themselves presentable. You gotta put on your best face, of course. Well, a man might have a cleaner tunic or a wide-brimmed hat decorated with a scrap of ribbon. And a woman, well, she might have a freshly washed headscarf or a dress with a bit of homemade trim. Small little touches of dignity. They might not be good clothes, but it distinguishes the best they had from the everyday rags. At least they weren't covered in dirt from the fields. Medieval peasant society was organized around the family, but that family unit existed within a larger tight-knit community. Most peasant households were typically husband and wife and the children living in a single cottage, simply because houses were just so small. But extended family members usually lived nearby in the same village, so a child might have grandparents or cousins a few huts away, but maybe not under the same roof. The average peasant married in their early or mid-20s, and couples would set up their own home as soon as they could manage it. Marriages were guided more by practical considerations rather than romantic courtship. A man needed a wife who could work hard and run a household, and a woman needed a husband who could support a family. The approval of the lord of the manor was required if the individuals were serfs. A lord might demand a merchet or a marriage fine, or even sometimes veto a match if it meant losing a valuable worker to another estate. In practice, most peasants married someone from their own community, or at least a close neighboring village. A medieval peasant wedding, well, that was a joyous and communal occasion. The couple exchanged vows at the church door with the priest's blessing, and then the village joined in a bride ale, that is a wedding ale feast featuring food, drink, music, and dancing for all. Children were plentiful in peasant families too, but childhood wasn't. It's not as we think of it today. It was more of a brief and perilous affair. Children were, of course, born at home, attended by local midwives, if they had one, or perhaps an older woman with a bit of knowledge. There was a very high risk of mortality. Many infants died in their first days or weeks, and childbirth was dangerous for mothers as well. Newborns were baptized within a day or two, with chosen godparents as sponsors, because if a baby died unbaptized, well, it was greatly feared that the soul could not enter heaven. The mother, still weak from delivery, typically did not go to the church for baptism. She stayed home recovering until a few weeks later, when she underwent a purification blessing called churching that marked her return to community life. Infancy was fraught with hazards too. Aside from disease, a crawling baby in a busy cottage could easily fall into a hearth or be accidentally smothered in bed. Once childhood grew past toddlerhood, they quickly became contributors to the household. By the age of 5 or 6, a peasant child was assigned small chores, fetching water with a little pail, scaring birds from the planted fields, gathering kindling, things like that. Perhaps they'd watch over the younger siblings, too. Bit of responsibility. But there was no formal schooling for peasant children. They just learned by observation, watching their parents and elders and doing what they do. A boy would learn farming, woodcutting, or his father's craft by observing and helping, and a girl would learn cooking, spinning, childcare, and all the arts of managing a poor household from her mother. As for playtime, it wasn't entirely absent. They might be seen kicking a ball around with other village children, or something like that, playing tag. But by their early teens, peasant boys and girls were expected to basically be adults and work as hard as adults. The village community itself was like an extended family, bound together by necessity and custom. Neighbors helped each other in times of need because everyone that knew misfortune, well, they knew it could strike anyone. If one peasant's barn burned down, or a cow died, others would organize a helping bee to rebuild the barn, or would share a bit of their own grain or milk to get that family through. Many tasks were done cooperatively. For instance, peasants had often pulled their oxen to plow the fields, as we mentioned. And of course, at harvest, the entire community helped reap and gather every family's crops in turn. But beyond the work, villagers shared in each other's life events and festivals. Not only weddings, but baptisms, funerals, the annual cycle of religious holidays, a bit of everything. Really, the church brought everyone together, too, especially on Sundays and holy days, and the churchyard or villages became a social hub after services. For recreation, men sometimes held contests of archery or wrestling on Sundays, and women often socialized while doing chores like spinning or washing clothes together. In the evenings, especially in the winter, villagers gathered at the alehouse or by a cottage hearth, singing songs, telling a few stories, and just relaxing. Village life It was regulated by both custom, but also a bit of self-government. The Lord's Manorial Court periodically judged local disputes and minor offences with a jury of villagers. Typical punishments were small fines or things like stray livestock or breaking village laws. Serious crimes, though, they were quite rare in the village and were dealt with by higher authorities. In practice, most order was kept by peer pressure and custom. Everyone watched everyone else and held them to standard. If someone behaved disgracefully, for example, an abusive husband, the community might respond with a charivari, a cacophonous prank at the offender's door, banging pots and singing mocking songs to shame them into better behavior. Perhaps we need to bring that one back, This kind of informal social policing often proved to be quite effective in a world where one's reputation among neighbors was critically important, especially if it's your barn that burns down or something like that, and, well, that helping bee, all of a sudden people don't want to show up. Now that is a little awkward. Well, before we go, let's talk a little bit about the truly unpleasant parts, but also a bit of the resilience. You see, as you can imagine, I don't think I need to explain it to you or say it again. The life of a peasant was certainly not a fun affair. It was full of danger and hardship, as even beyond the everyday toil, and foremost among them was the threat of hunger. Peasants lived harvest to harvest, and if the crops failed, well, they had little reserve to fall back on. Bad weather, such as excessive rain or drought, could ruin the grain yield just like it did in 1315 to 17, where the Great Famine was caused by rains across Europe. Well, people in England at this time reportedly either starved to death or survived on acorns, weeds, and possibly even substitutes like tree bark. Even in less dire times, though, winter and early spring, the lean season before the new crops grew, often meant empty cupboards. Malnutrition was a chronic problem, leaving peasants weak or more vulnerable to disease. The poor peasant might be driven to begging or theft to feed his children if his own stores ran out. Starvation was a very real spectre in the Middle Ages. It kept peasant communities in a state of perpetual anxiety about the weather and the harvest. And then there was the disease. Medieval peasants had no knowledge of germs and very limited medical care. A village might be visited by a wandering barber/surgeon, or have a local wise woman who knew herbal remedies, but nothing really resembling a real doctor for the poor. Epidemics could sweep through and kill indiscriminately. Of course, we all know about the Black Death of 1348 to 1350, which killed around half of England's population in a matter of months. Entire villages were emptied out. Those who survived were, of course, traumatized by the loss of family and neighbors. Other diseases also took a great toll. Periodic outbreaks of sickness, dysentery, fevers, things like that, swept through the villages and carried off the weak. Even injuries or infected cuts could turn fatal for lack of effective treatment. Peasant women faced the danger of childbirth without any real care, and many unfortunately died delivering children. So what was the life expectancy? Take a guess. 50, maybe. 40? Well, it could have only been around 30 to 40 years. But this is kind of skewed, because most children died so young, so the averages are kind of off. So we can put it between 40 and 50 years old, perhaps. You might be lucky enough to live to 60, but that would depend on your circumstance. In any case, those who did reach adulthood and avoid lethal diseases, if you managed to get to that natural death point where you could live into your 60s, but that was far from common. The labor, the poor diet, the lack of medicine meant that most peasants were old by our standards when they got to their 50s. That's if they lived that long at all. But peasants also bore the brunt of man-made hardships. Chief among them were the heavy taxes and rents imposed by lords and the king's government. Lords could levy special talligays or fines arbitrarily when they needed money, and the crown expected nationwide taxes, often to fund wars that landlords would just pass on to the peasants. In the late 1370s, for instance, King Richard II's government imposed repeated poll taxes to finance military campaigns. These taxes fell on humble villagers and provoked quite a bit of resentment. Coupled with long-standing grievances, like villeins being legally unfree and owing labor, this unrest erupted in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. It was in that year that thousands of peasants in southeastern England, led by figures such as Wat Tyler, and inspired by radical preaching, rose up in an armed people's rebellion. They marched on London itself, calling for an abolition of serfdom, lower taxes, and an end to corruption among the royal officials. And for a brief moment, the rebels terrified the ruling class. They even executed the king's treasurer and dragged out a few other hated officials too. King Richard II ultimately quashed the revolt. The rebel leaders were deceived and killed, and the peasants' demands were officially denied. However, the uprising was certainly a turning point. It frightened the nobility, and perhaps it accelerated the decline of serfdom. In any case, in the following centuries, things began to change, and, well, little by little, the peasants got their own back. And so for all these hardships, they demonstrated a remarkable resilience. They developed coping strategies. In times of dearth, they foraged on wild foods and tightened the belt. When epidemics struck, they turned to faith, organizing processions and prayer vigils for deliverance. Surviving community records show that peasant communities provided communal mutual support. If one family was going through hard times, well, people would try to get them back on their feet. They met adversity with a dogged practicality, replanting, rebuilding, and just getting on with it. Over time, some of the hardships did ease. For example, the late medieval decline of serfdom and the slight improvement in living standards after the plague reduced the population. But new challenges, such as renewed warfare or later the enclosure of common lands, would arise. Through everything, the peasantry endured. And the very fact that the English peasantry survived century after century of exploitation and disaster, well, that is a testament to tenacity and the capacity for hope. And so maybe we learn a little bit about perseverance and tenacity that we can apply to our modern day. Who knows? Maybe as well we can learn from the peasants and identify those people in our community that are having a bit of a rough time, and we can pull together and help them out. People are a little bit too scared to put their hands up and ask for help these days, so maybe it's up to us to ask the question first. Are you all right? What can we do for you? What can we do for each other? We just hope everybody remembers it when the other side's time comes. In any case, let's not go into that. I am going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters, though. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Amber, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfred, Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Gary, Katie B. Lovely, Boma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivelo, Chris, Apocalypstic, very cool, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Pretty, Aiden, Fabian. Is it Fabian or Fabian? Not sure. Maybe it's Fabian. And Mikhail. Thank you very much for joining me. So what did you think? What do you think about the peasants, huh? You tell me in the comments, okay? That's enough for me for tonight, and so we'll go and have a nice little rest and meditate on what we've learned. Good night for now. See you in the next exciting video. Lots of love to you all.